When it comes to voting, I am a strong believer that you should be voting where you reside at this current point of time, because your life now revolves on where you are residing today, not 10 years ago.
Hello, welcome to Beyond the Ballot Box. I'm Dashran Yohan. Today we are kicking off a new series called Road to GE, a show that explores your power in deciding who serves you in government and how that could change your life. On our first episode, we are going to be discussing this whole idea of going back to your hometown to vote for elections. Now, every time there's an election in Malaysia, there's, all these talks you always hear about, needing to take a couple of days off, and then the boss doesn't want to give you off, so what to do? Traffic jams, increase in prices of flight tickets, and all of this is because people are trying to rush back to their hometowns to vote. There are even campaigns done by civil society, such as Pulang Mengundi, to basically encourage people to pack their bags, go back and vote for elections. This is something as Malaysians we are all very accustomed to. But what if I told you that this is incredibly bad for democracy? No, not traffic jams, which are just bad for sanity, but the fact that people, going back to vote going back to their hometowns to vote, that is bad for democracy. So why do I say so? Well, joining me on the show today to help me unpack everything and answer this question is Danesh Prakash Chacko. He's the director of Tindak Malaysia. Welcome to the show, Danesh. How are you doing?
I'm good. Thank you very much for inviting me into the show.
All right, Danesh, before we get into the conversation, right, tell me a little bit about yourself and what Tindak Malaysia, which is the organization you're part of, what is Tindak Malaysia all about?
So I'm the director of the civil society group called Tindak Malaysia. We are one of the many NGOs that endorses BERSE. Our focus is on electoral reforms. So our activities, which started since 2008 after GE12, particularly focus on various elements related to voter education, starting with polling agent and counting agent training people to be redelineation objectors, and then subsequently about constitutional reforms. And now in the post-G14 era, we are looking on how we can improve the electoral system that we have in Malaysia bit by bit with fellow civil society organization and also our new working relationship with the Election Commission.
All right, Danesh, I'm going to come clean to start this off, right? For the recent Johor elections, I myself drove back to Johor to vote. And on the way back, I got stuck in the traffic jam for 8 hours. And, I was feeling very proud of myself. I went back to my hometown to fulfill my civic duty, something I gave myself a pat on the back. But you have argued for many years now that this shouldn't be the way. Why so?
First and foremost, when it comes to voting, I am a strong believer that you should be voting where you reside at this current point of time, not associated with where you were born in the early years or 10 years ago, the address that you used to live, because your life now revolves on where you are residing today, not 10 years ago. So this is how I say, this is a fundamental reason why I'm not in favor of individuals to retain the older addresses. So this is that's the starting premise when we come for this topic.
Danesh, are there any laws in Malaysia that sort of are in line with what you are saying right here, or is this more of just your personal opinion on the matter?
Okay, first of all, foremost, there is no law that compels you to update your voting address
right
when you change your location. There is a law to make you obliged to update your residential address on your identity card if you have moved, let's say, for more than 90 days in a given place. But there is no obligation when it comes to the voting part. Why is that so? Because in Article 119, that specifically talks about the voter himself or herself, the option is given already. The voter chooses to change or transfer his address. And more so in the new regulations in the registration of electors, Regulation 12A, any person who has registered as an elector and desires, let's underline the word, desires, not obliged, to transfer his registration to a different locality in which he is qualified to be registered, shall apply to any registrar of any registration area or any assistant registrar of any registration unit. So how you will do is that you have to fill up one form. You only can apply once during the electoral roll gets updated. Right now, the electoral roll gets updated every month, unlike last time 3 months.
Right. So now you say that, while there is no law to compel people to change their voting address, there is a law that people should essentially change their address on the IC, which then will lead to once changing their voting address, right? But why is this the case that, despite there being this law, like, you see, it's not just a matter of few people going back to their hometowns to vote, right? We are talking about thousands and thousands and thousands of people every single time there's an election. Why is there this widespread sort of non-compliance to this law that says that you should be changing your IC to where your residential area is, where you're currently residing? Or is that the case where people are changing their IC address, but people still want to go back to their hometowns to vote? Well, based on your observation, where does this...
I'm more inclined of your second view.
Right.
Because when you update your IC for your address, it's because you are going to update your billing address. You're going to notify your workplace, this is my new address. I'm not staying in Johor Bahru and work seems to be working in KL. For example, that's an example.
Mm-hmm.
But that doesn't translate that sense of need inside of you to update the voting address. Because the law says desires to transfer his registration means it's on you. And if the desire is not there, basically you will be held back by sentiments of the past, the nostalgia of my homeland. And maybe it also could be related, maybe some states, I can't give any particular states in reference, you may have particular rights that might be associated if you've been residing as a voter or a resident of that state. So I'm not sure whether that also holds back someone from updating the voting address.
Right, and that's something I've heard. This idea, you brought up the word nostalgia, which I think is it's really on point for many instances where people have this, like for example, I'm a Johorian and people like, I've been staying in KL for 15 years or whatever it may be, but no, I'm Bangsa Johor. I have that pride, and somehow that pride just gets active. Whether they are supporting whether it's during a football match or during elections time. Somehow there's that pride that comes out, I'm Bangsa Johor and all of that. Why, you have, even in conversations, with a colleague of mine in the past, she asked you something similar and you said, there's, you don't like this idea of people using nostalgia and sentiment and all to base these decisions. Why is this idea of nostalgic view of patriotism or democracy bad in your opinion?
Put it this way, you are shaped by the politics of your surrounds, not by politics of your hometown. I'll be upfront. So for example, if you reside in Selangor and you happen to be the Kelantanese voter, as I've written back in the Malaysia Kini article, you are affected by the policies of the Selangor state government on far greater level than the policies that takes place in Kelantan.
Right.
Okay. Similarly, this is particularly more serious is Sabahans and Sarawakians who are working in Peninsular Malaysia. And we're not talking about working for 30 days. For years, for months, let's say more than 3 months. You are affected by the policies of the state government, by the local governments here in Peninsular Malaysia. So this nostalgia doesn't match to the realities. So you are probably retaining a potential illusion that as though my association with Sabah or Sarawak through voting can make a difference. The answer is not really. As a matter of fact, I would progress from this topic.
Mm-hmm.
Now you can see Sabahan parties, some of them, and this is not new, it has happened before. They already start looking to spread their wings beyond Sabah. They, like for example, Warisan. If I'm not mistaken, Upco previously, they have already got probably branches here. And as a matter of fact, we can see in Johor, Warisan contested. So you want to maybe bring a new discourse of how Sabahans manage politics quite well, maybe in your eyes. You want to bring it here because you are staying here and most likely you're going to stay here for many years.
Right.
But if you do not update your voting address and you say, for example, I support Warisan, but I happen to stay in Johor, and the time came, the opportunity was there to vote for Warisan in Johor. But I can't, because at this given point of time, my name in the electoral roll indicates I'm a voter in Sandakan, not in Johor Bahru.
Right.
So that means you lost the chance. And bear in mind, with elections, it's once in 4 years, once in 5 years. And especially if political parties don't do well, they might close shop or they will give up on that state.
Right. So you've brought up two reasons so far. The first one is, two reasons for why people should change their voting address. The first one, you say people should vote for leaders in the current constituency who represent you geographically, because that's the one that's going to affect you directly. You also brought up the idea of, parties spreading their wings. Let's say if you're Sabahan, if you are voting in Selangor, for example, and a party from Sabah wants to come, there is more weight rather than if you go back and then the parties themselves are only stuck in wherever they are regionally based. What other reasons are there?
Okay. Interestingly, when I wrote the Malaysia Kini article last year about this, what triggered me was the outcome of that Sabah election that resulted in the explosion of COVID-19 cases.
Right.
So what has happened was, with the Sabah elections, you have voters coming from Peninsular Malaysia, flying into Sabah. You have campaign workers flying from Peninsular Malaysia to Sabah. So in the process, when the pandemic was very serious at that time, you might be healthy here, you interacted the people in Sabah, you brought the pandemic here,
Right.
and that triggered the big wave. I'm not saying all voters are responsible for this. I'm just saying that the fact that you don't update your voting address means that you, with your nostalgia, say, I want to go back and vote to carry my responsibility. It's all good in intent. Unfortunately, the impact was this, and where we were set back quite badly. Of course, this is a very rare situation, but it exposed the problem at hand. Okay, that's one. Let's talk about financial effectiveness.
Right.
Okay, especially those Peninsular Malaysian voters who still want to retain their Sabah Sarawakian address. Bear in mind, your Sabah Sarawakian address is not Kuching, Miri or Bintulu. Most likely an interior part of Sarawak. So when you fly, bear in mind, postal voting has not been expanded. That is a separate issue of its own. Advance voting for the Sabah Sarawakians here is still not there. Okay, that's a separate issue of its own. With that sense of responsibility, okay, I will fly back. Then I have to spend money to find the transport to my longhouse, to that particular polling center. It sometimes can be very long because the infrastructure there is not solid.
Right.
So it actually burns your pocket a lot for just to carry a responsibility to vote.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I want to ask a follow-up on that, right? Because I think at the heart of this, right, and there are some other reasons we will be exploring, is this idea that, you should be voting where you are residing for various reasons. But the thing is, right, when talking to my friends about politics, right, many do not think about local issues. Now, this could be pretty much a bubble thing that we are living in, where maybe certain local issues are not affecting certain bubbles or whatever. But that's sort of like, the conversations that I've been having and I've been hearing is that they don't think about, this particular residential area, this particular issue and all. Instead, they are thinking always, when my friends talk about politics, they're always talking about national issues. Do we need a shift in mindset? And how does this shift in mindset, if we do need it, will benefit day-to-day Malaysians?
I believe we need to have that shift of the mindset. And that's not because we desire for it. It's because it's already upon us. After GE14, we have noticed that states have already started to, especially particularly Peninsular Malaysia, have already started calling their own elections outside of the parliamentary cycle. Bear in mind, many years ago, the last case would be Kelantan in 1978.
Right.
Okay. Sabah, Sarawak, they already have a history of having election cycles separate with parliament. But now, you can have Melaka, you have Johor, you never know which next state. So this forces on everyone in that area, whether you're a voter or not, how does that state government policies affect my life? So this is where your voting power, whether you are voting resident in that state, comes into play. You will be start being differentiated for that.
Right.
So that mindset shift has to take place because let's be very clear, in the federal level, we have a lot of difficulties to push through reforms.
That's
But
right.
are we going to give up by saying there is no hope? No, the answer is no. That sometimes you have to push your state governments to push the reforms. For example, I think 1 or 2 years ago, if I'm not mistaken, like Penang declared internet as a form of utility.
Right.
Did the Penang state government had to wait clearance from federal government? No. Then later on, federal government, if I'm not mistaken, followed suit.
Right.
So if you want to push for some certain reforms, sometimes it's pointless to push it at the federal level. So you have to push it at the state government. Hence, your state government policies impact you more strongly than ever.
Another reason you brought up in your Malaysia Kini article that you wrote, I think it was a couple of years ago, is that you don't want suspicious voters to appear on our electoral roll. And your quote was, and I'm quoting here, so please don't be a suspicious voter yourself by remaining an outstation voter. What exactly do you mean by suspicious voter?
Suspicious voter means we are not sure whether this person is legitimately registered in that place before. We do not know. Okay, what is the intent of that person being there or not? I'm 50-50 on, let's say, on that intent or how it was done.
Right.
The reason why I mentioned this is during the Rantau by-election 2019, we studied the electoral roll and we noticed some houses had unusual composition of voters. They are not related. Yes, you might argue they could be rented or not rented, or the family could be big. We do not know. But when you see this sort of houses with unrelated voters, that triggers suspicion. Because then it raises the question is who actually is legitimately residing in that house?
Right.
And who have moved out or leasing the property but seems to have the voting address associated with that. So we told EC, these are some of the houses we think is questionable voters. So EC actually went down on the ground. And what they have found is these people who claim to be a voter in there have moved out, but they didn't tell EC. And EC cannot compel them to update the voting address because what the law says.
Right.
Desires to transfer his registration. So what happened, why I'm telling this is because before GE14, we all know that our electoral roll was littered with suspicious voters, like big houses, voters registered in unrecognizable addresses and whatnot. So you have all this bigger mess, and then you have outstation voters in the mix. So it actually makes difficult for NGOs, for political parties, for EC to ensure whether who is actually legitimately a voter in this given area and who is not.
So another reason you brought up is also this idea of polling logistics planning. And it is important for the election commission that you just brought up to know the correct voter population in each location. Why is that important?
See, one of the aspects related to redelineation that people don't talk about is actually the constituency should be drawn with the idea of sufficient facilities for polling machinery,
Right.
referring to polling stations. So what can happen is you can have a constituency where most of the voters are outstation,
Right.
and EC would say from their own point of view, they do not know that's the outstation per se, for example. So they will say this place got 1,000 voters, so they might have to allocate 1 or 2 polling centers. Example. Was it really needed in the first place? When most of them were actually voting elsewhere, where probably elsewhere you needed to have more polling stations.
Right. So on that, I'm wondering if that's why occasionally you see, instances in G14, for example, where, there are certain polling stations where they allocated like X amount, but the number of people that there were either like exceeding or less, and so in certain polling stations you have barely anybody there, and then in some polling stations, like even until 5 o'clock, people can't get their vote through, and then the polling station closes. Are these like some of the consequences you're talking about?
These are called indirect consequences, because some of them we have to apportion the blame to the election commission for not thinking through properly. But that's just part of it. But it could be in that particular mix, you have a lot of outstation voters coming into play.
Right.
So then you end up probably overloading a place that what it shouldn't have been overloaded.
So Danesh, another reason, right? You brought up this idea, like earlier you mentioned the word redelineation. And I think that's a very important thing that we need to discuss, because one of the reasons, and I think this is perhaps one of the most poignant reasons you brought up in your previous interviews, even columns that you have wrote, is that if you say that if you, the people, want fair electoral boundaries that don't discriminate based on residence, your voting address as well needs to be current. Can you explain this a little bit more? And also, why do people think they are being discriminated against in the first place?
Okay, first and foremost, when it comes to electoral constituency boundary drawing, one of the fundamental basis of that drawing of the constituency is the current electoral roll. Okay, one of the electoral rolls. So your electoral roll is composite of all the voters who are at a given point of time registered in that constituency.
Right.
So if your base is faulty, i.e. incomplete address and a potential outstation voter, a suspicious voter, then fundamentally your starting point to draw fair electoral boundaries is already off the track. Anyway, that's what's happening. Now, let's go back to the topic about this discrimination. So yes, according to our constitution, all Malaysians should be treated equally. Sure. So how do you translate that as a concept in reality, not just merely words?
Right.
So one of the aspects is how our electoral system works. So we practice first past the post system, simple election system. And how it works is in our every constituency, we send one representative. One for the parliament, one for the DUN. Not like other countries are multi-member. So because of this, your size of your constituency, I'm talking about electorate size, not so much area. Area shouldn't be a big issue right nowadays, except for Sabah and Sarawak. With the constituency electorate size differs greatly. Let's say one constituency has now 300,000, let's refer to Bangi. And then you have on the other side, let's say Sabah Benam. This is still in Selangor. You have only 50,000.
Right.
Both of them send one representative each. So that means the voting power in Bangi is extremely low. You're talking about 1/6 of Sabah Benam. As a matter of fact, Bangi, let's give credit, YB Kian is effectively managing a police. That's the size. That's the size of the province electorate, right? So I also believe that sometimes that could be used as an argument.
Yes, and that's what that's the thing, right? And that's the argument that I would use. Like I said at the start, right? I said that I go back to my hometown to vote. And my reasoning is I don't have that nostalgic sentiment kind of thing. My argument is that I'm doing it strategically. Because if, let's say, for example, I'm staying in a constituency in Bangi or in Damansara or wherever it might be, and I feel that, there are 300,000 people going to vote, what difference is my vote going to make? What is one extra vote, in a constituency of 300,000 people in which you already know 99% who's the winner going to be. And this is not just constituencies that affect one party. It can be Pakatan Harapan constituencies, it can be Barisan Nasional constituencies, it can be PAS constituencies, whatever it may be. And so for my sort of reasoning is a strategic reasoning. I say I go back to Johor. Like, if I cannot, my vote is not going to make any changes here. Myself, I go back to Johor, where the competition is much more tight, and then I vote, my vote there has more value. So how do you respond to people like me who bring up strategy as the reason why they don't want to change their voting address?
I mean, strategy in voting or tactical voting, that's up to each person to decide who to go with. Okay. And bear in mind, with competition now, it's going to be more stiffer. This is no more like GE12, GE13, to a certain degree, even G14, where you only have 2 large blocks. Now you have multiple blocks. So in future, Johor is competitive already.
Right.
Malacca is already competitive. Sabah is always competitive. In future, Selangor will be very competitive. So in the end, it goes back to eventually to you. Who are you affected the most? Is where you stay. And where you stay is not about 3 months stay. We're talking about 1 year, 2 years, 3 years. And now let's be very clear. Let's say we take an example. If you're a resident in oversized Subang, but you are a voter in oversized, you're voting base and you still not to choose update is the oversized seat of the brow. What difference it makes? It's just that you spend a lot of time driving down and losing money in the process and unnecessary frustrations. Okay, that's one scenario. So those who resides in one urban area and choose not to update their voting address to a new urban area, let's be very clear, you are not actually helping anyone, even yourself. Okay, that's one. How about those in the rural constituencies? Okay, so you're being as a outstation voter for the rural constituency. Yes, you can say, when I come back, I will contribute my vote. Does it really make a difference? I think that's the most important issue we have to address, because these small size constituencies, eventually they need to be equalized. Right now, the problem with small size constituency, what I've learned, is generally speaking, their poverty rates are very high. So you going back, voting, how much difference can you make over there when you're not even residing there? Yes, you might say, I'm remitting money. Yes, but you're remitting money to one household. You're not necessarily remitting money for the bigger parts of the constituency. So like for example, this one thing I have studied, probably let's say this noticeably in Sabah Sarawak, the absolute poverty incidence of an undersized small constituency is around 3 times or so, or 2 to 3 times higher than the oversized constituency. So that also raises a question, right? You can be a voter here. You are working here, making money, remitting money, and spending the money to travel down to cast your vote. And you've been doing this for not about one election cycle. You're doing it for 2-3 times. Does it make a difference by now? No.
Now, another thing you brought up earlier, Danesh, is this idea. You mentioned that, some people may be hesitant to change their address because, maybe if they are in certain states or certain constituencies or whatever it may be, have certain benefits afforded, and they're like, I want to get those benefits and still, but although I'm living here now. Is there on the flip side, is there like a flip side to it where people should perhaps start thinking about, okay, there are benefits in, a lot of different constituencies offer different sort of benefits and whatnot. Since I'm staying here, I should probably register here as a voter, and then maybe I'm eligible to the benefits here and I don't have to worry about the benefits afforded me in another state where I'm in Kelantan or Sabah or wherever, because I'm in Selangor right now and I can reap the benefits of the Selangor government.
Yep. That's an important point that you have raised. Let's be very clear. For some of the states, as mentioned before, I talked about reforms, right? You don't need to wait for federal. So the state governments actually have financial capacity, have the initiative to conduct welfare programs. And they will list out the criteria. Okay, so for example, that's for the mothers, the KISS program in Selangor. What is one of the requirements? Must be a voter in Selangor. So let's say your socio-economic status or whatever, you managed to meet all the requirements. And then they looked your IC and they checked, sorry, you're not a voter in Selangor. You just self-denied an opportunity for you to prosper in the state. Is Selangor the only one? No. Penang, Aisajatra, for the welfare program for the elderly, for the single mothers, anak emas, right? For example, the anak emas, which I have not studied fully what it means. Yes, the child is not registered as a voter, But what is the qualification? The parents, one of them or if not both of them, must be a voter in Penang. So, if I might say, if you love your family, better do the right thing.
And that's very interesting. So like the two big things that I'm getting from you, right? When it comes to people talk about strategy and all of that, and we want the elections to be electoral boundaries to be very fair. And so what you've been stressing for for the entirety of the conversation is that if you want, there is a higher chance of pushing for a fairer electoral boundaries and electoral, fairer redelineation and all of that if you update your address. Because now, like, let's say in Bangi, there's 300,000 people, for example, and the case is maybe we are trying to make a case, it's not fair. Imagine if everybody who actually stayed in Bangi updated and there's 400,000 people, for example, it's not going to be that much of a thing, but let's just say it's 400,000 now. Then you got a big, stronger case to say like, why? It's already 350,000. It's already 400,000. You have to, push the hands of the EC and say, we need to make changes here. And also the idea of, you brought up like the state benefits and welfare programs and things like that. There is this thing that people want the benefits from a different state and whatnot, or cannot get the benefits from their current residing place. And again, it goes back to the chicken and egg thing that you've said, right? You want benefits here, but you're not a voter here. Then you need to get the benefit from another place, which is not practical because you're not living there. So it's better to change your voter address. And even if the state does not give the benefit, now you have a sort of added ammo to push the state. So let's say if I'm Kelantan as a benefit that state Selangor doesn't have. As a Selangor voter, you can now push for better government, push for different MPs who are saying, I will give what Kelantan or Sabah is giving, I will introduce it here. Is that the big picture thing that you're essentially highlighting here?
That's one of the last arguments I will push. Because I noticed when I studied their requirements, there is a clear intent why Selangor state government will put that requirement, Penang state government will do that, even Perak does it. Okay, it's not just Pakatan Harapan states. Yes, they have their own reasons because in a way they want your votes back.
Right.
Let's be very clear about this. But it is also to your benefit. So I mean, we talked about you're traveling this far, you have to spend this amount of money, then the frustrations of the travel associated with it, and sometimes your impact may be not as great as what you think it is compared to being here. So if you ask me, this is why I put this one of the final arguments. It's like, you're affected by the policies of the state. At the same time, you would be entitled to the benefits of the state that you reside, on the condition that you update your voting address so that when a welfare program is offered to you, you are not technically disqualified for one sentence.
Right.
Are you a registered voter of the state?
Right. Let's talk about perhaps a little bit more of a philosophical question here, perhaps. What are the long-term consequences towards democracy and our lives if we continue down this path for another 10 years, another 15 years? People just don't, they don't want to change their addresses and people just keep going back to their hometowns and going back to their hometowns. What are the consequences of this?
Okay. What are the consequences? I think we have to see in this in a few ways. Okay. Right now, you will see like a generation of migrants move from one state to another. So they will retain their voting address of the past. Okay. So in the longer term, they probably perpetuate the same policies, what they used to believe. That's their choice.
Right.
It's not really a big consequence. I think what happens is actually the next generation, right? The next generation, most likely they will be registering themselves here.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So then I think in a way it will balance out a bit. Now if you ask me what's the consequence of this, this is a challenging question. I will be upfront on this. Fundamentally, one big element of democracy is elections. The fundamental foundation of elections is the electoral roll, who defines who is allowed to vote and in the manner that person is allowed to vote. Not your constituency boundary, not the polling staff, not the conduct of the election. This is the fundamental element of any elections, the electoral roll. And we know when the electoral roll is littered with irregularities or anything in between, the outcome of the election is not necessarily desired of.
Right.
Okay? And now, let's be upfront. Sometimes a political fatigue is kicking in. You know, sometimes political parties, when they say, we're going to have a by-election in Cameron Highlands, I'm trying to spend energy trying to get my outstation voters from of Cameron Highlands who happens to stay in KL, in Subanjaya, Shalam, but they're not coming out. So in the end, I lose. Because you are focusing your energy as a political party, you're focusing energy of people who are not having a real stake there at that time. When you should be actually focusing and swaying the voters in that area. So I would say there is not so much a direct consequence, indirect consequences.
You know, Danesh, we've been talking a lot about how changing your address might benefit you, and it's about that individual, right? I'm wondering if there are, you know, sort of ethical considerations on how you going back to vote in your hometown could be ruining things or disrupting things for people who actually reside in that place. So for example, you can be a Pakatan Harapan supporter or a Barisan Nasional supporter. Let's just use a Pakatan Harapan as an example. Now you are saying you want to go back to a Barisan Nasional state. You are in Selangor and you have, you know, accustomed to this sort of style and policies and all that, and you're like, okay, now I'm a Pakatan Harapan supporter. And you're like, I want to turn Johor also into a Pakatan Harapan state. And so now you're like, okay, I'm going to go back, although I don't stay there, I'm going to go back and vote for Pakatan Harapan. Now this can be applied to any party, right? But I'm going to go back and I'm going to vote for Pakatan Harapan. But the people who actually stay in Johor might be like, why are you doing this? Like, we actually like our constituent, you know, like our MP or Adun here, who is not from Pakatan Harapan, and they are doing a good job. Why are you coming, you know, is that element there, you know, where people are going back and they might disrupt things for the people who actually reside in their hometown?
I actually don't, it's my first time hearing that sort of argument, but I don't see it that way. Because fundamentally, that constituencies, and let's be very clear, like semi-urban rural constituency, who comes out most to vote? The rural, followed by to a certain degree semi-urban. The urban voters, most likely, they barely show up. But it's also because the outstation voters are not making the point to come back.
Right.
Okay. So I don't see it as really an issue of disrupting the politics, because this outsider who claims to be a Cameron Highlands voter suddenly come back here. It's actually where the so-called disruption comes in is when political parties, for whatever reason, okay, for good reason or bad reason, they come and study the electoral roll. They looked at this. Hey, this voter not here. Then why is this person here? And they look at not one, but multiple. What's going on? Then they will start making a fuss. So what happens if the situation is quite tense? Maybe you come back to vote, and suddenly you, as the outstation voter, unnecessarily receive problems.
Right.
So not so much a disruption to the local voters. I see it's more like, are you inviting people to suddenly call you falsely pengundi hantu? Or suspicious voter, that's more appropriate term. So yeah.
Okay. So like at the start, you know, I came clean and I said, you know, I wasn't, you know, like I'm one of those people, suspicious voters who, you know, go back to their, you know, one among thousands who go back, you know, to their hometown to vote and all of that. I'm starting to buy into this idea that you're selling here. But I want to ask, does the onus fall on me? Is it my job to, you know, update my address and do this and that and, you know, all these extra steps that I have to do? Because a lot of people might be just like, you know, like this is what I've been doing, like I'm just going to continue doing it. Is the onus, does it lie on me, or should it lie on the election commission to ensure that all of these things, you know, to change, or, you know, or does it lie in legislation perhaps? You know, the word desire, if you give people the option desire, then everybody is just going to do whatever they desire. Do we need to sort of have reforms in that sense, legislative changes or anything to perhaps shift the onus away from the people who are not engaged in all of these things 24/7. They're just like, oh, election time, what to do? Okay, go back and vote lah. That sort of thing. To, just making things more simpler and more automatic and more, in that sort of way. What do you think of that?
Okay, at this point, putting the legislative reform aside, the onus is on you because that's what the law is saying. Okay, let's be very clear. Legislative reforms must take place for this area. Okay. Now, in Article 119, previously, the voter it mentions the voter chooses to apply to register as a voter.
Right.
So it's as though he desires to choose or not. You know what was the result? Before the Undi 18 implementation, easily 3 to 4 million Malaysians opted not to register as voters.
Right.
Okay. Now, Article 119 got amended in light of the Undi 18. Now, voter is registered. You don't need to do anything except to check your details on the SPI website that have you been automatically registered or not. Okay? And I just want to highlight something also on this point. This is where your residential address must be updated, because the law specifically now says that the registrar from the EC, he must be satisfied by the details that's provided by the department who manages the Malaysian citizens registration. What is one of the details? Your address. You need to make sure that is correct. If not, you are inviting for problems too.
Right.
Okay. Now, when it comes to legislative reforms, I will be upfront. There's going to be challenges because there are certain political parties who are dependent on these outstation voters, which I choose not to name.
Right.
Okay? So they would, and some of them prefer to maintain the status quo for whatever reason they might be. But if you make the life of election commission difficult, because you cannot have an electoral roll that is reflective of the reality, and which I just realized something. Our electoral roll is a fantastic archive to discover extinct roads, extinct buildings, extinct settlements. Let's be I have actually detected road names that doesn't exist, and to the point that I have to refer to very old maps. Oh, so like this is an example. Like in Miri, there is this road called Jalan Belon. You go today, there is no road Jalan Belon. But if you go and refer to a 1960 map, there was like this road.
Right.
So I would say, then what's the purpose of your electoral roll? Is your electoral roll an archive?
Right.
Or the list of people who are qualified to vote?
So what you're saying is, until today, in our electoral roll, there are buildings that don't exist, roads that don't exist, residential areas that don't exist anymore.
Yep. So like, for example, like Sulaiman Court. If I'm not sure what is now changed altogether. You want to study the addresses of that Sulaiman Court? Go ahead. Go look at the electoral roll. You will see that that's the type of unit number. Or maybe you can even find the person who used to stay there. So, fantastic archive doesn't serve for elections.
Okay, I think at this point I'm sold, Danesh. Like, you have really convinced me that what I've been doing is, although it's it's left to my desires, probably I need to change this desire of mine and start voting where I'm residing. What do I do? How does one change their voting address? What is the first step until the thing? Because it sounds like, I have a lot of things to do, and if I'm the average voter, I'm like, okay, I don't want to do these 20, 30 different steps. Is it like so complex? Like, break it down for us.
Okay, in light of the Undi 18, right now, there's one form called Borang A, Form A. Form A was previously used for registering voters and also transfer of address. Now it's just purely transfer of address. So you just need to fill Form A. You can check the SPI website and also to get the details of how to do so. But one thing I know is you can go to the post office. Make sure your IC address is updated first. So you have to go to JPN, make sure your IC address is updated. Now JPN is a bit more strict on the policies on updating the address. They will require evidence. You clear that step, then you take the updated IC, bring it to the post office and say, I would like to fill up the Form A to transfer of my voting details. Fill up the form, and in a month's time, check on the SPI website, make sure your name is there, and you are moved to this area. Make sure the the name of that area reflective of where you are going to.
Right.
If not, fill up Borang C, like a claim form. Now the electoral roll is being updated every month, so you don't need to wait for 3 months anymore.
Right.
I tried to find a bit more details whether one of their mobile applications is applicable for voter registration update address details. I'm not very clear on this part, so I can't comment. You can go for post offices 1, SPR's HQ, SPR state offices, or you just call SPR and confirm whether is there a way you can do online updating.
Right.
If it is not, then post office. Because last time before Undi 18, EC opened up the opportunity to do online voter registration.
Right. Okay. So it doesn't sound too complex there. I think like everybody should definitely take these steps and start updating their addresses for the sake of our democracy. Now, but just one last thing. What if you're, not someone who has been staying in another place for 8 years and so a few years or whatever? What if you're a nomad and it's not, it's either by choice or because, your work is someone who takes you 2 years, you're staying in this state, another 1 year you're staying there, then you're staying for 7 months here, and then another 3 years there, and you don't have a base camp, so to speak. You don't have a headquarters of a home or anything like that rooted in a particular location. What advice would you give these people?
Okay, this is also one of the challenges when we talk about updating the legislation on trying to figure out a constructive address that represents your residency. I can't comment much on this, but that's more from a legislation point of view. Okay, let's go back to what the JPN rules are. So if you are, let's say, residing less than 3 months, then there is not so much of a need to update your IC address. Do you need to update your voting address? No. It's actually more than that. Because chances are in your life, one way or another, you will end up in the post office. So you can just update, right? Because you just do not know when the election will come.
Right.
So let's say now with the option now that the electorals are getting updated every month, so you're more in time for the next election, wherever it is. So for example, 3 months you stayed here, you don't want to update your voting address. Then 6 months later, the next posting, you ended up in 6 months somewhere else. And suddenly, elections took place. And you felt that, I want to vote, but too expensive to fly back to, let's say, to Kota Baru. Or too expensive to fly back to Kota Kinabalu. You lost your chance.
Right. Absolutely.
So I would say, for the moment, let's try to follow the principles that are laid by JPN. Although you're not obliged, I want to be very clear. You stay more than 3 months, update your IC address, update your voting address. Then you will be ready for elections. You're ready to also accept the benefits that the state government has to offer.
Yeah, and you'll only need to drive 500 meters away from your house probably to vote instead of taking a flight and paying thousands of ringgit. All right, before we wrap this conversation up, Danesh, would you have a final message for us?
My final message is, please update your voting address as soon as possible because we do not know when GE15 is going to take place.
All right. On that note, thank you so much for joining me today, Danesh. That was Danesh Prakash Chacko. He's the director of Tindak Malaysia. If you missed any part of this conversation, it will also be available on podcast, so you can just download the BFM app or go to our website. Also, do follow BFM on social media. We're available on Twitter, Instagram, and even TikTok. Just follow at BFM Radio. I'm Dashran Yohan, and this has been Road to GE on Beyond the Ballot Box. Until next time, bye-bye and take care.